You probably think that procrastination is bad, that it's the enemy of progress, but if that was true, how come people like Leonardo da Vinci, famous for taking months, even years to finish his works, completed some of the most famous works of art in human history? Now, that's just one example of an infinite amount of successful procrastinators, but if you are a procrastinator, you might wonder why then you aren't successful. And it turns out there's a spectrum that reveals exactly why. Look at this graph. On the right, we have hardcore procrastinators who can never seem to start or finish any task. And on the left, we have precrastinators. Yes, that is a thing, and you've definitely encountered them before. See, a precrastinator gets anxious about a task as soon as it's given to them, so they start working on it immediately and finalize it way ahead of the deadline. Remember those people in school who had already finished an assignment before you had even put your name down? Those are the precrastinators. So going back to the graph, these are the two extremes. On one end, nothing gets done, and on the other, everything gets done as soon as possible. Neither of these is a good place to be, but if you're anything like me, it's hard to understand how it's not the best to be a precrastinator, seeing as they get everything done in a timely manner. Well, this is where it starts to get really interesting. If we fill out the rest of this graph with the remaining information, you'll see that the y-axis here is creativity, and this curving line represents a spectrum of people where the middle is the highest in creativity. This peak represents people I like to call the originals, those who challenge the status quo and change the way we do things. To do that, however, they need to think a bit before they throw themselves in the deep end, also known as procrastinating, something the precrastinators don't do. See, if you start working on a task as soon as it's given to you, well, you'll just solve it the way it was intended to be solved, or at least in a far less creative way, as you haven't allowed yourself to think about tackling it in the most creative way. This is fine in a school setting where the point isn't creativity or originality, but simply rote learning. But for that new exciting side hustle, this just doesn't cut it. So procrastination has its place. Now, I'm not at the peak of this curve, and chances are you're not either. So how do we move ourselves closer to the middle? Well, first we need to figure out where on the graph you currently are. I might be a bit to the right on this graph, thinking a bit too long before I act. I tell myself that it's okay because I've been thorough in my planning and won't make as many mistakes when I eventually do start. But that's just an excuse. In reality, if you're like me, we shouldn't spend weeks on end trying to figure out the best way to approach something. Instead, we should start a bit earlier. At some point, it's just fear of starting that is holding you back, and no further plans will help you accomplish your goals, only action will. Now, if you're a precrastinator, try and force yourself to procrastinate on the task even though it might eat you up from the inside. Changing the phrase, "I'm procrastinating right now," to "I'm thinking about how I'm going to approach this task" will help rewire your brain to accept and welcome the wait. But let's be honest here, the real challenge on the spectrum is for the hardcore procrastinators to get going, and that's harder than we might realize. But understanding why this is and how to solve it will help us all deal with procrastination better. See, whenever a task feels too big, it's because we've made it too big, which happens whenever we take something unmanageable and making it into this undefeatable monster in our head. We do this because our brains don't know that we're not supposed to complete the whole task all at once. So whenever a task feels too big, break it into bite-sized pieces. If, for example, you've been assigned an essay that has to be 10 pages long about the, media's influence on public opinion, well, it may seem quite daunting, because when you finally sit down to write it, 10 pages seems like such an enormous amount of work you simply can't force yourself to start. You don't really know anything about this, you haven't ever written about this before, and you haven't listened in your classes recently. I feel like we've all been here at some point. So here's what you should do. Figure out the immediate next course of action, only consider the next action, and also only as a mere possibility. Sort of if like you were method acting. What would you do if you were to do the task even though you're not? In this scenario, you would probably start by finding some sort of study about the media's influence on public opinion, but you can be more specific than that. How about finding the first study that shows how easily people's opinions can be manipulated with false information? I mean, that's just an idea, but you get the point. Doing this will make the task much more manageable for our monkey brains. And it's important to realize the task can be as small and insignificant as it needs to be so that you actually do it. There's no shame in making the next task opening a new tab in Google or figuring out what to search for on Google. It should be the smallest and easiest task necessary, because once you figure out what you need to do, it naturally becomes easier to do it as you've now removed the uncertainty. The great thing is, if you choose to procrastinate after you've written down the next course of action, it will be significantly easier to get back to the task after you're done procrastinating, because when you sit down again, you can look at the next course of action and know immediately what it is that you are supposed to do, instead of having to read like the past 5 or 10 sentences to figure out where you came from in your script. The interesting thing about this rule in procrastination, though, is that in some way, shape or form, it relies on willpower, not motivation. But that's because motivation follows action. How often have you been feeling truly motivated about something recently? Maybe once or twice, maybe a few times, maybe not at all? That's because motivation is worthless when we don't do any action, and this is why we need to minimize the task at hand from being a big, scary monster that we need to conquer all at once to a small, scrawny monster that we can easily kick in the balls. There are other ways to trick your procrastinating brain into doing work though, like the 2-minute rule, forcing yourself to do a task for just 2 minutes and then allowing yourself to procrastinate again. It's proven that more often than not, you'll end up working for longer than those 2 minutes, because if you sit down and do something for 2 minutes, it's very likely that you'll keep going because now you've slowly entered a flow state. But here's the thing, all procrastination is just friction. So your job is to figure out what that friction is and remove as much of it as humanly possible. What I've done is put into words all the possible frictions that could prevent me from doing a task. If that task is reading a book every night for 30 minutes before I go to bed, then a possible friction could be having to find the book on the bookshelf, bring it into the bedroom, and then start reading. So what I've done instead is I now put my book on my bedside table, so there's no friction for me to go and grab the book every night. Even better would be to put it on my pillow. That's a pro tip for you soon-to-be avid readers, as you would have to remove your book from your pillow to be able to get into bed. But what I find interesting about procrastination is that it seems from the literature that people who can forgive themselves for procrastinating tend to procrastinate less, which was surprising to me because I beat myself up all the time about procrastinating, telling myself that I'm worthless, telling myself that I'm not good enough, telling myself that I'm not doing enough all the time. But according to research, you should be easier on yourself. Realize that procrastinating is part of human nature. It's hardwired into our brains. This makes sense, right? Because not too long ago, if we didn't save our mental and physical resources for an unexpected event, we could very easily die. But times have changed. If we did that today, it would simply be called laziness. And successful people are anything but lazy. It's important to distinguish between these two because lazy people won't ever start that new side hustle, whereas procrastinators will. Eventually, it's just a matter of time. And the length of that time is what separates the sheep from the goats.